Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know it's a bit of a hot afternoon, but I assure you it will be a cool one by the time we finish today. This is a one-of-a-kind festival, so welcome everyone once again, because the Cargill's International Women's Day Festival of the Changemakers was actually conceptualized and designed to showcase not just great high-achieving females, but also to get a male perspective, which we will have throughout on a couple of days of the festival. So it will be 4 days of dialogue and discussion, and today's one is actually focused on 3 young women who have made peace their code to actually work towards some kind of activism as well, because in this generation will be the generation that's taking forward, or he has inherited a legacy that we ourselves have left for them. And as peace prompters, they have been working very much behind the scenes. I just want to say thank you to Table by Tharu for joining me, because my online program, Kaleidoscope with Savitri Rodrigo, has started off in May last year. And what we wanted to do was actually highlight issues and create discussion platforms on issues that people sometimes don't talk much about. And thank you to Tharu for actually taking this on board, and to Mahika, who has been my great support ever since this harebrained scheme came to be. Cargill's our festival title sponsor. Thank you very much for being with us. The UNFPA, who's our event sponsor, exclusive radio partner Light 87, exclusive digital media partner Daily Mirror Online and Hi Online. All our media friends for being ever so supportive of this project. Thank you so much. Healing Island, our wellness partner, for the very handy sanitizing wipes you have in your pouch. Wild World, Zonin, and Olu for our beverage partners. You'll find Olu on your tables. And also Kist Absolute Juice, 100% fruit content with no artificial flavors or preservatives. Kiz GB, which is a natural ginger extract drink, again, completely natural. And Kist Ride, which again is on your table today, sparkling decaffeinated drink to add that wave of energy. And of course, later on in the evening, you'll be treated to a range of cocktails and mocktails, giving this combination of Kist drinks as well as the Wine World range of beverages. So, on with our show, it is 21 years since the UN Security Council passed a resolution on women, peace and security, which is the UNSCR 1325 resolution. This recognized the importance of full involvement and equal participation of women promoting peace and security. We all know that women are disproportionately impacted due to conflict, and more than ever through a war, through various insurgencies and riots, it's actually women who have faced the brunt of it. But very little has changed when it came to giving women a bigger voice, a bigger presence when it comes to peace and security and reconciliation. But women are central to peace and security decisions, even though their roles as agents of change has largely remained unrecognized. But for the few women who have, like the 3 here, they have navigated language barriers, racial, ethnic, religious, and cultural demarcations beyond the gender dimensions to facilitate a more proactive engagement. So given these 3 ladies, let me run through just a very brief bio of each of them. I'll just wait for the Air Force to finish their training bits. Amalini, who is in the corner, she works in media and communications in the human rights space, carrying out research, documentation, and awareness, as well as advocacy on issues faced by communities around the island. Sarah Kabir, who's just next to me, is a researcher and author who specializes in the areas of peace building and reconciliation. Her publication, Voices of Peace, gives insight into the circumstances, lives, and choices made by former rebel fighters as well as the Sri Lanka military personnel. She's currently leading a documentary project that will explore and highlight critical moments in Sri Lanka's post-independence history. And Yamini Ravindran, who's the Director for Legal and Advocacy of the NCESL, is an ardent advocate for freedom of religious or belief for the past 10 years and pioneered the Minor Matters Project, which was a public campaign that seeks to promote FORB in Sri Lanka, which gained 4th place at the 2019 Intercultural Innovation Award by the UN Alliance of Civilizations and the BMW Group. She's also the Executive Director of the Asia Evangelical Alliance, Religious Liberty Commission, and oversees the status of religious freedom in 17 nations in Asia. Ladies, let me ask you a question of all three, actually. So let me start with Sarah, who's closest to me. The question is common to all three of you. Given that ironically, peace seems to be a very dangerous area to get into. What made all three of you actually go into that space? Because it's not an easy place to travel, especially for women. Sarah?
Okay. So I think for me, my journey started in 2009, quite late in the conflict. It was when I heard the war was over and I was actually overseas doing my undergraduate. And then all these questions came in my head about who was involved. I mean, we know it was the LTTE and Sri Lankan military, let's say, but really who were these people? What had happened? And as those questions came into my head, I remember feeling quite annoyed at maybe the privilege that I had had in being so secure throughout the conflict. And then I guess I realized that there was a way to use that privilege into doing something that had an impact. So it was about finding my voice and using that voice for something that could be impactful in making peace in this country. Regarding that it was a dangerous territory to get into, I think at that time I was young, and I still am young and idealistic, and I didn't really take into account the danger that lay ahead. After I came to Sri Lanka, a year after that is when it really started to hit me how cautious you had to be, and even very careful with the words that you use, because reconciliation, for example, is a word you can't really use in Sri Lanka today. It's frowned upon. So yeah, that was my journey.
Yamini?
For me, my journey has been different because I was initially actually involved in corporate and commercial law. And when I got into it, after I got the hang of it, I didn't find a lot of passion in the work that I was doing. And then I thought I want to be involved in human rights. And at that time, to be honest, I didn't think peace building or peace and reconciliation. But fortunately, and it also has a lot to do with my faith as well, because I believe in justice and peace. So I was able to get connected to an organization such as NCSL, which was very much involved in work of social transformation and freedom of religion or belief. It is then that I realized that as individuals, as much as this work is dangerous, and yes, it has its pressures and challenges, the kind of change that we can bring about as individuals, not only in our communities and in our societies, but also in other individuals' lives as well. And sometimes it can be a very small change, which may be insignificant to us, but it is a big change in that individual's life. I remember one of the first issues that came across about a little 6-year-old schoolgirl who was deprived from following her religious faith in her school. And it was a simple letter that I sent as a lawyer and took it up with the school administration. She called me back, and her mother and the little daughter, they called me back and they said, today we are so happy because today I went to school and I was not punished, and I was able to follow my belief, my tradition, and nobody forced me. And that was the point then when I realized that the kind of small things that we do, the big impact that it has upon an individual's life, and why this work is so important. And that has kept me in this work amidst these challenges for the past over 10 years now.
Amalini?
So I think my experience is quite similar to what Sarah said as well, is when we, once you step out of your comfort bubble of the circles that you've undergone your education and your socialization in, you realize there's so much that we don't know, that we should know, and that we should be actively engaging and caring about. And when people ask me this question and they ask me, why do you do kind of like the awareness and advocacy you do, I tell them it's because these issues really make me angry or passionate, and I want to affect some change, and I'm just amplifying it, passing it on to you, hoping that someone else will feel the same way and take it up in the same way. So yeah, for me it was like a succession of learning about struggles various communities face and how prolonged these have been. Like, these aren't just things that happen in a vacuum, how there have been struggles that are going on for 20 up to 30 years, and just wanting to maybe move the needle even in terms of just the conversation, create the smallest amount of awareness to create some sort of difference. Yeah.
I'm sorry, we will just have to live with the noise, I think. Amalini, and also the two of you also can join. Amalini, there is a lot of rhetoric about women being agents of change. There's a lot that women can do, etc., etc. But how does that actually translate to women on the ground? Are they actually given a chance to be a part of the peace and reconciliation process?
I would say on the ground, women are some of the most active in engaging with their communities, in creating conversations, in creating safe spaces. So much of what I know and I've learned, I owe to like small women's groups in, whether it's in Puttalam or Jaffna or Batticaloa and people like that, who are on the ground, who are not just having conversations about bringing, say, Muslim and Tamil women together, but who are actively supporting maybe war widows or women who are facing domestic violence and things like that. So in terms of that long-term sustainable change, women are doing so much of work, right? And I feel like it's the media circles and the spotlight, but it's always the few of us in Colombo who get talked about. But there's so much of work going on outside. In terms of being a part of the larger reconciliation process, personally, I feel like those women are not given as much of a spotlight as they need to be. And I feel that's up to those of us who are in Colombo and closer to the proximity to these centers of power to actually do that work. And maybe we're not doing that enough. That's just a personal view, but definitely like when you see, just whether it's just getting together, women getting together to sing a few songs and have like a space of fellowship and solidarity, I think at the ground it's women who are actually doing that. Like you said, they are being those agents of change.
Yamini, in your experience, how has this worked?
I think Amalini has spoken well as to how women have been change makers and how they have played a very important role in this area of peace building and peace and reconciliation. I think it's also important for us to note that as much as they are doing very important work, women are also facing a lot of challenges in the ground level as well. If you take, for instance, digital literacy in Sri Lanka, according to the Sri Lankan statistics, in 2019, women have only 28% or 26% approximately of digital literacy, which is a massive challenge and barrier in today's context and world. And then we also see how women have always had to fight harder in everything that we do. And be it to have access to resources or even to power. And I think women will truly be able to, at a community level or even at the highest policy level, be able to be very effective and far more effective if we are able to give them that space. And maybe later on I'll touch on how it's so important that we provide protection for them as well.
Sarah, you've spoken with both the military side and the LTT side for your book. What were your findings when you not about the men actually, but the role that women played in this whole, in that scenario.
Right. So, just for all of you, I mean, the book that I did, it looked at the stories of 10 former LTT cadres and 10 Sri Lankan military. My gender aspect is not great, I have to acknowledge, because I was focusing on frontline cadres, and in the Sri Lankan military, the thing is women were not sent to the front lines most often, but with the LTTE, that wasn't the case. So one of the main things I think that was interesting to me was in speaking to the women from the LTTE, in how they saw their status as very equal. They said that their training was done very equal. They would carry these RKG, these rocket propeller grenades, which are huge weapons. So there was no difference in that sense. But of course, this is talking about violent equality, so it's not the greatest way to be made equal. But with the Sri Lankan military, one of the narratives a lot when I spoke with the men was that, I would have liked to think that it was about safety for women, or, but it wasn't. The conversation was mostly about the fact that women lacked the skills or the sort of ability to work in complicated situations. That was sort of the narrative that came, especially from the Air Force, actually. So yeah, I mean, there was quite a stark difference, but what is really interesting is today, in talking to them, there is a similar gap in how much we have done to translate their roles from during the war to what they are today. Both from the military side and the LTT side, they struggle a lot with their new roles and responsibilities in everyday society. For the former LTT cadre women, there are issues with marriage, not being able to get married again. I mean, some of these women who would go around with these big weapons are now scared to even step out of their house at 5 o'clock in the evening. So there are a lot of these issues that remain unaddressed for these women, which I think needs a lot of focus today.
Just a follow-up to that about the women who were fighters but now are in everyday situations. There will be very many who will turn around and say, well, they've asked for it.
Yeah, so a lot of them, what they do is they don't try to say that they were with the LTTE, so that's something, a label that they try to hide because of exactly this. And it's not just coming from communities that aren't Tamil, it's from within their own homes, their own villages that they live in, that this is a problem. So that label is one thing that they want to remove or they try to shy away from. So there needs to be a lot more awareness, I think, from civil society and government level in talking about these individuals as more than just LTT cadres, because a lot of them were pushed into a corner and they didn't really have much of a choice when they decided to pick up the weapons. So that awareness, I think, will make us start to believe that they are more than just terrorists.
Yamini, from the conversations I had prior to this with all three of you, one of the things that actually came out was that peace is not just a men-only or women-only thing. It's a united effort where genders should just unite and get on with it. However, the peace process, for the most part, has always primarily been driven by males. Now, how do we change that? How can we get more women to be actively participating, to be seen? Because obviously being seen is when people realize, yes, women can do it.
I think first we need to be able to understand what is really peace. A lot of the times we think peace is absence of war or conflict or violence, whereas peace is actually the work involved in dignity and well-being for all as individuals. So then if you look at it from that aspect, I think the way that we look at peace and the way that we look at women involved in peace, our perception completely changes. And for that particular question, Savitri, I think it's also important for us to know the important role women play in peace building, for us to actually bring them to that equal playing field. So for instance, if you take war or violence, I think when women go through war and women go through violence very differently to men, and their experiences are very different as well. And also, I think women have insights into violence, into war, because of the role that they play in the community as family and even as guardians, very different to men as well. At the same time, I think women bring a very unique perspective into possible solutions for conflict as well, because their experiences and their perspectives are very, very different. So the moment we know how important they are and this kind of equal but unique perspective that they bring to the table, then I think in a united way we need to be able to affirm women who are already out there, who are doing this work with positive affirmations, and at the same time enable women at the community level, actually encourage them and show them that if they do get involved in this work, they will be safeguarded. There is protection. And when I say protection, not only in practical sense, but also by legislative mechanisms, structural changes. And if we are able to do that, then I think more women from the community level will come forward as well. And one cool fact, which I got to know, which I thought is important to mention, according to research and UN research, it actually shows when women are involved in peace agreements and negotiations, 64% likelihood for such negotiation or agreements to fail. So in fact, women are very indispensable in this work of peace building.
Interesting fun fact that. Amalini, you mentioned also that things can be difficult, challenging for women who are in the peace process. Just some examples. How difficult is it? What are the challenges these women face?
Okay, I think firstly, it is in the home or in the community, like I think Sarah mentioned, the dual issue of being active in this kind of work and also facing patriarchal norms about what you should be doing. Should you be going to meetings? Should you be, out there talking about issues like this? And we hear from women in these communities who hear, they hear men spreading rumors about their characteristics based on the fact that they are outspoken and they're vocal about these things. Or she's not a good Tamil woman, or she's not a good Muslim woman because of, she's out there, putting herself out there. And in the second sense, I think Yamini mentioned, is the physical security of surveillance and intimidation that comes from state structures. After the Easter Sunday bombings, or even after November 2019, when the government changed, where women in these grassroots organizations who are effecting the most amount of concrete change on the ground are the ones having, intelligence showing up at their offices and asking them questions, asking them about their movements, tapping their phone lines, looking into where they get funds from. So definitely, like Yamini said, there needs to be a level of, as much as we say, women need to come to the forefront, women need to do this work, when there is a system of intimidation and pressure that disproportionately impacts women, because there's a difference to when you're the woman on the receiving end of, an officer in uniform coming to your door versus it being a man, especially in the context of conflict, when there has, there is a power dynamic there. If those protections and if there isn't safety in place, then we need to question: is it fair of us to be telling women, come do the work, when there is no mechanism to protect them from any backlash?
So is it a cultural thing, two of you?
Cultural thing. I think in all communities, I'm just trying to locate the different women that I know who work in this field, and I think a lot of, I guess, whether it's Tamil community, Muslim community, even Sinhala Buddhist community, it seems to be very much not the place of a woman to be at the front, or to be having, leading little focus group sessions in your village level. It's not really often sort of allowed in some senses. But to add to what they were saying, I think with women, I feel one of the things that we have more of an influence on our household, in the sense, even in this patriarchal system, women have more time with children. So we it doesn't mean sometimes not every woman can actively get on the streets or actively participate in this peace building role, but there's so much that can happen informally in this informal structure that people overlook quite often, just in your households, just the way you teach your children, the sort of words that you use, just in sending your neighbor food, just simple ways that you can actually be involved in the peace building process in this country that's quite often overlooked, I think. Which it doesn't matter what culture you come from, I think you can still do that.
Just to maybe add to what Farah said, I feel Sri Lanka is a country that is deeply rooted in culture and tradition. And for me, one of the challenges and something that I have been, pondering about is as much as the role of a mother and a sister or any other supporting role is not to be undermined in any way. When it comes to women, for example, let's take religion, right? If you take religion and if you take women, how are they perceived in religion, in different major religious doctrines? Most often, women are supposed to have particular characteristics, virtuous, obedient, modest, right? As much as these are not bad qualities to have, we are stereotyped, we are put into certain role models. Then once again, when it comes to peace building as well, even in the work that they are involved, a lot of the times it's a mother's role, it's a sister's role, it's a teacher's role, or another supporting role. For me, my question is, as much as those roles are very important and cannot be undermined in any way, why can't women be involved in peace building as independent leaders and just be leaders who are spearheading peace building work as well? So definitely it's cultural, and I think religion, culture, and different social structures that we are part of play a huge role in this.
So, Amalini, how do women actually get a seat at the table for peace and reconciliation? I know it's like a crystal ball question, but...
I think, like I mentioned at the start, there are women doing the work, and that's like, I just want to put that out there because I think there is a misconception that women aren't doing the work, or, they take the back seat because even with all these challenges, there are women still putting themselves out there to, better their communities. I think definitely it involves some people taking a step back and allowing space for the women who are doing that kind of work. So while we see them effecting change on the ground, do we see those women, those women's groups involved in policy level discussions about reconciliation, development, and how we go forward? We've had two governments doing consultation, asking people how they want things to be done going forward from the conflict. But all those consultations where women have gone forward and made a lot of recommendations, those reports, like many others, are just gathering dust somewhere. So definitely we need more women to actively look to bring those women representative of the various places in this country that have seen some of the brunt of the conflict, to bring them to the policy making table, whether it's writing local policy around post-war development, or whether it's discussing the interventions to make at the UN in Geneva. We need to kind of put in the effort. That's the thing, it requires effort, right? It requires making an extra phone call, getting a translator on board, or making the journey to go and visit and speak to these women. But if we are going to be like, oh, it's a little difficult to do that, so we'll just call these few people that we know, who we know will answer, kind of thing, then nothing, like the needle is not going to meaningfully move. And some of the resistance or the opposition we've seen to some of the few kind of transitional justice, if you even want to call it that, mechanisms that the Sri Lankan state has put forward, has been concerns from survivors and victims saying, what this is trying to do is not meaningfully impactful to us. So what is the point of those mechanisms being in place if they are not going to really address meaningfully what the people who need them the most want to be addressed? So definitely I think, and this is not on the part of the state as well as on the part of civil society, media, we do need to take like an active effort and put in the work to make sure that those voices are captured as well.
Yamini, religion for most of its part, has been used as a weapon to cause divisiveness, fragmentation of communities and societies. How can, I'm just taking this up because you said we are often stereotyped as mothers, sisters, teachers, whatever. But how can bringing women into the formula help in diffusing some of the volatility we have all been facing in this country due to that religious divisiveness that has seemed to come forward in the last few years?
I think, Savitri, it's important to know that it's not religion, but mostly Sri Lanka has been divided according to religious identity. And even in politics, religion is politicized and religion is used as a tool. So most often it's religious identity. Now, if you take religion and if you take faith leaders, I think over the past several years in terms of needed terms of huge crisis, they have played a very active role in a very positive way. You take the civil war, even if you take the tsunami, where faith leaders have played a very active role. At the same time, you have faith leaders who also flame religious tensions as well and extremist elements, which is very much happening in Sri Lanka. Now, in this context, if you take women and if you take every religion, there are some kind of biases or discriminatory practices that are used against them as well. So I think that provides a platform for women to come together collectively to stand up against it. And I think Sri Lanka, if you take, is one such very good example where women have come together and they have been able to effectively campaign on the Muslim Marriages and Divorces Act, the MMDA, where a lot of good work has been done as well. And there are very prominent women out there, let it be at a national level, at a community level, who are doing a lot of good work to not only bring neutrality into this whole discourse of religious identity, but also maturity, and they are also reformists as well. So I think that is the important role that we play as women. And for me, that is commendable. I mean, in Sri Lanka, the kind of work that we have seen that has been ongoing.
Again, this is a question to all three of you. Let me start with Sarah. Sarah, we are constantly on that platform of saying we're a multi-religious, multicultural, multi-ethnic country. Do we really believe that?
I think different people will have different answers about this, but over the last 5 to 10 years, I feel like that belief has really withered away. I feel like we like to say this for, to bring in tourists maybe into the country, but how much each one of us in this country practice that and understand what multicultural, multi-religious means, allowing people their space and freedom to practice the religions that they believe in, to mourn their dead if they want to, which in this country today, it seems it's really scary, but to me, it feels like even amongst the youth, the move is towards a very monolithic sort of country where everyone should pray the same way, dress the same way. If you wore a pottu or a headscarf, you're not really a Sri Lankan, or you're a second-class Sri Lankan in some way. So no, what I think is I don't think in Sri Lanka we really believe in it, or we understand what it means to be united within that diversity. Is not really a language we are aware of.
Yamini?
That's a very complex question, Savitri. I mean, I agree with Farah in one sense, because if we truly see ourselves as people who are multi-ethnic and multicultural, which we are, and that is, I think, the richness of our culture and who we are, but we have somehow lost it somewhere down the line. And there seems to be deep-rooted issues of mistrust between communities. And as Farah said, I mean, today you see youth who are perpetrators of religious violence and who even use social media platforms, and they are instigators of violence. And research actually shows that youth between the ages of 24 to 35 are those who speak most hate speech online as well. So I think, I mean, we have a lot of issues that we really need to address. Let it be past violations, let it be present context, and a lot of the things that are happening. I mean, even if you take the forced cremation issue, and we are happy that it is being reversed now, the kind of thinking that goes into it. So I think we have to go a very long way. And as Einstein says, peace is not something that comes forcibly. It comes with understanding. So we need to be very serious about creating this understanding between communities, between different religious identities. And I think that is the way forward. So for me, I personally feel like we have so much more to go and so much more to address.
Yeah, so like the others said, it is really not an easy question to answer, but yeah, I know a lot of people, we use the Sri Lanka is diverse, that line I'm going to say for various purposes, but two things. Firstly is that the Sri Lankan state has not been very respectful or accepting of that diversity in our post-independence years, right? Because down to our institutions and legislation, we have seen the discrimination of minorities historically and in our politics. And when I say that, I know a lot of people immediately will say, oh yeah, it's our politicians who are constantly trying to divide the country, and you know, we respect diversity. They are the ones who are using it, weaponizing it. But I think this many years, this many decades in that kind of framing means that we have internalized that as well. So it is very much in society, and it is in the way, you know, the way the conversations that we have around the conflict, around the place Muslim people here have in this country. So it's more, it's on, like, the onus for that to change is both, I think, on the state to actually make sure that to actually respect the diversity and show its citizens that yes, you are present in this country. We are not just using you as a little token card for when we want to look good, but we respect you in our institutions. You are represented in our decision making. We respect your beliefs and your practices in legislation. At the same time, it is on us as individuals to kind of put more work into not just tolerating diversity in that, okay, you do your thing, I'll do my, and you know, we'll just be kind of thing, but in actually, you know, working towards the solidarity in that diversity, and not just using it as kind of like a token concept. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone questions for my panel? We just need one person to build the cat, and after that it'll flow, I'm sure. Yes. Just a minute, I'll get a microphone across to you.
Thank you. Well, Sarah said reconciliation wasn't a very popular word at the moment, and I know there have been attempts in the past to try to talk about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I think you know, all three of you had such valuable insights into the whole diversity and the racism that is currently prevailing in this country, and how it should start changing even from the grassroots. As you said, we're expecting too much from the politicians. How do we overcome the stereotypes that we have of each other? And I know in South Africa, for example, you know, when they don't like to use that example too much, but isn't it about facing each other and talking about fears and, you know, good things, bad things, what do we think about each other to first overcome some of the issues that we have? Because a lot of things are said within homes, within schools, within communities of one kind, and then it spills over, it's passed on through children, and that's how you perpetuate racism. So my question is, would something like a Truth and Reconciliation, you can call it some other name, be useful to set up here? Maybe interreligion, interethnicity, that type of thing, people who are interested to start that sort of discussion going.
So for want of another phrase, the Truth and Reconciliation process. Who would like to?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, actually, we were about to get there in 2018-19 or so, but So there were 4 mechanisms that were supposed to happen, and 2 of them came about: the Office on Missing Persons and the Office for Reparations. But the TRC didn't happen. But I am an ardent believer that if we are going to really believe in our plural identity as Sri Lankans, I believe we need an awareness of our history, of where we came from as a people, as a nation. You know, we each have our own version of history. Every community, one community will be trying to say we've been here 2000, the other one's trying to say 2001 years. But you know, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, when you really look back into history, we are such a big mix. And I think, for me, I think the fact that this is not taught in schools, that our history curriculum really evades from talking about the important things that have happened in our past, and teaching a sort of plural version of it rather than just one Mahavamsa version, let's say. So that, I think, is one of the key things that need to change, because that it can happen in households, I don't have that much trust or faith in, because we are all a generation who has come out of a particular education system, and we believe one thing and we pass that down to our children. So I think it has to happen formal education system. And also, just to add to what Amalini was saying, I think it's a really interesting point of in the community level, there is a lot of work that is happening, which we are unaware of. Or we always think everything is happening in this Colombo bubble and everything has to happen from this center. But really, there is a lot more work being done at the ground level that needs to be brought up. And at the same time, I feel this might come out wrong, but I think the privileged of us are the most apathetic, which is really sad to see, because we have so much strength to actually influence policy, to create spaces, to get more women engaged. But the most of us who have this privilege and luxury to think about these things rarely ever do until it really hits home. So I think that's also something that's really important to lead to change. Yeah.
Anything you want to add, ladies, to that? Any other questions? So I was thinking, since there aren't any questions from the audience, what would you ideally like to see in a true peace and reconciliation process in Sri Lanka? All 3 of you can. Maybe Amalini, we start with Amalini. And no? Yes.
So, first of all, like, I think I've mentioned this multiple times, but I would want to see it to be informed fully by survivor communities, victim communities who have been at the brunt of the violence. If we're taking reconciliation in a post-war sense, by full buy-in from the communities that have been affected most by it. And as much as things like the TRC would be really useful to create that, we need that. Like, I fully believe that one of the biggest ways to move something would be conversations that are open, that are complex, that are not polarized. It's not me trying to cancel out what you're saying, but us trying to acknowledge that both these realities can exist at the same time. As much as that is important, I do think like there's a huge onus on the state to take one is to take responsibility, to ensure accountability, because like in the context of the war, people have witnessed so much of violence and so much has been done to them. And you know, when we, like you asked Yamini earlier, what does peace mean? How can we expect people to accept that there is peace when there has been no justice done for them, when the people who have perpetrated violence against them are, you know, still in positions of power? When, like, I was just thinking, and it's funny that this is all happening right now, but what does hearing the Air Force jets fly around on Independence Day or today sound to someone who lived in, you know, the war zone? And you ran from those. You didn't just listen and look at them and be like, wow, that's so cool. Sorry, this might not be a very popular opinion. But yeah, like, how do we, because I feel like we can't move forward in a constructive way as long as we haven't addressed those issues. And what we hear from leaders repeatedly is, why do you keep looking back? Like, we should just look forward, right? We can't, like, if you stop looking I think our current president might have said this at some point as well. But if you keep looking back, it's not going to do us any good. We need to look forward to be able to go forward. But when you leave so much unaddressed in the past, how are communities meant to feel like they are equal citizens in this country? How do we make it feel like the wrongs that have been done to them, we recognize those wrongs and we believe that they should see some sort of justice for it. So without accountability from that side and from us really respecting the needs and the voices of victims, I feel like those are the two things that really need to go into a reconciliation or peace process if it were to be truly meaningful.
Yamini, something that Sarah said, the education process leaves out a lot of our history, which we should, again, to look forward, you need to look back, learn the lessons and move on, but it cannot happen the way it is. How do we change this, since it's never going to happen in an official capacity, how do we then change it in a way where education, this kind of education becomes a priority? How's that going to happen?
Yes, we know the traditional way of doing it, I mean, in terms of the syllabuses and all of that, but yes, that's a very long shot and seems like a very long-term approach. So what I would encourage people involved in this work at a community level, at a national level, is to find non-traditional and innovative interventions to kind of do that. So for example, right now at the NCESL, we are working on an intervention where we are about to launch a virtual museum addressing freedom of religion or belief in Sri Lanka, and looking at key events which are positive and negative, and even events where communities came together, so coexistence. Because like you said, Savitri, history, a lot of history is biased history that is being taught to the kids. So we need to be able to bring in that alternative narrative and that neutral narrative. So that is one of the things that we are hoping to do by the virtual museum when we launch it in August, giving an alternative narrative to historical dialogue on freedom of religion or belief. So I think each and every one of us, it doesn't have to be something like developing a virtual museum. It can be so many different things that we do at a community level, in trainings that we have, in different interventions. Working with children, I think, is very important, and working with youth, very, very important. Something that I think we miss when we work with children and youth is we don't speak their language. Now, if you take the extremist elements, they seem to speak their language and they are very effective. And because of that, youth and children and even often women are very susceptible to extremism in Sri Lanka and globally. So being intentional when you work with children, when you work with youth, and even when you work with women, to speak their language. So if technology reaches out to them, speak through technology. If comic books reach out to them and cartoons reach out to them, speak through those means, and keep addressing those alternative narratives and alternative historical dialogues to them. And I think that is the only way forward, which I foresee as practical.
Any questions? Anyone? So let me conclude with one final question to all three of you. What now? The path to peace seems very challenging, and women specifically, though they do have that role to play, are going to find it extremely difficult. What are the challenges you foresee, and do you have any solutions you can put forward as well?
Right. So right now, the biggest challenge, I think, is a lack of commitment, both from the top and from the bottom. There's very little interest in the world of peace building and reconciliation. I think because of that, it has left room for these sort of ultra-nationalist camps, extremist groups from different communities to prop up. And all of this has made a positive peace in this country very far away. I can't really see when it's going to come about. I think, I mean, many might not agree with this, but there was one president in my understanding of our history, Madam Chandrika, who was one of the only leaders who seems to have really believed in this idea of peace and spoken this language of peace throughout, trying to change the. So she had that Sudunelu movement. So there were people like Dr. Radhika Kumaraswamy, all these women spearheading this campaign of a plural narrative, changing people's consciousness in the 90s. And it worked at that time for a bit. So I think we can look back and take a little bit of examples from that as well. So it's not that it's not going to happen. I'm very idealistic, like I said, and I believe we can get there. But right now the problem is this lack of commitment. And as much as we'd like to blame the leaders, I wholeheartedly believe now it's because of us. We are the problem, because we leaders give what we want now. As a society, this is what we are demanding. We want racist, discriminatory policies. That is what makes us happy. That is why we will vote you. We all talk about, oh, we want a Jacinda Ardern here, but that's never going to happen. This country is never going to vote for a Jacinda Ardern right now. So we have to change our mindsets. Forget about the leadership. First start changing our mindsets, and once we do that, I really think it can lead to a more peaceful country. And just on the aspect of women, one of the last things I'd say is, like you started with, women are often seen as victims in conflict. Women are disproportionately affected during conflict in that way, where women's bodies are battlefields. Rape is a weapon of war that is used. So there's been but very little research on the complicated role that women play in conflict. It's more than just that. Women's roles keep changing. So there needs to be, I come from the background of research, and I think there's very little research done on this, and there probably needs to be more research, and that might help in getting women a larger say in the peace building process, and that way we actually address the concerns of women when we take up ownership.
Yamini?
I think it's important, other than what Farah also mentioned, to look at women in three different perspectives. Now, when we take peace building, we only see most often women as victims. But women are victims, women are perpetrators, and women are also reformists and advocates. So for us to do this work very effectively, we need to be able to see all those three angles. And even in terms of extremism, women are more susceptible more and more now to extremism as well, right? So that factor needs to be factored in. Then secondly, I think in peace building and in this work of human rights that we do, and peace building and peace and reconciliation, a lot of the times women perspectives are brought on board to just tick a box. It's like a nominal affirmation. So a lot of them would say, oh, because we need a woman's perspective. And I wonder sometimes, what is really a woman's perspective? Okay? So we need to be able to address that too. And finally, I would like to say now, even in this COVID-19 challenge, Savitri, if you take the world and globally, research actually shows, the World Economic Forum in their research where they analyzed 194 countries, they said countries that were led by women were more effective in how they curtail COVID-19. And because women were risk averse when it came to deaths, but also very much risk prone when it came to economy as well. And they proved to do far better than other countries in comparison. So there is so much more, and so much so that a woman can really bring to the table in terms of leadership, in terms of all of this work that we do. So for it to really be effective, I think we need to bring in not only policies, but practical measures, legislative safeguards, like I said before, so that you encourage women at the community level to feel safe, and make those a reality in Sri Lanka, to really empower women to come to the forefront. And even as Sarah and Amalini both mentioned, it should not be a Colombo agenda or anything like that, but something that stems at a national level, at the highest policy level, and at the grassroots level as well, and at the community level too.
So I think one of the things we need to combat going forward is, like Sarah mentioned, the apathy that stems across the board towards these kinds of issues, right? A lot of us get very comfortable saying, I don't care about these things because what can I do to change it, or it doesn't affect me, and things like that. And it is really going to take kind of engagement across the board from everyone to be able to build a society that's more equal, and for people of all genders, all ethnicities, all religions, every kind of ability and things like that. Because I think the moment we slip into that apathy, we just allow problematic leadership to kind of step in and steer things the way they want it to. And secondly is, like it's been mentioned, politics and divisive policies have been used to divide people to maintain tension, because that benefits those in power, right? So what is one of the effective counters to that is broad-based solidarity across kind of communities. How can will those divisive policies won't work against a people that are united, really standing with each other. And I know at this point in time it might sound difficult, and it definitely is because of years of conditioning and learning and what we have been taught. So it's going to take, first of all, a lot of unlearning from the place that we are to be able to see everyone as equal participants in our society. And because at the moment, like, there is some sort of fragment, then there is going to be a way, and leaders are going to use that as a way to widen that, make the divide wider, right? So I think the stronger we stand together, we do have a chance. I'm hoping that we do have a chance at moving the needle in a meaningful way.
So lessons to take back. Peace depends on us, our responsibility. Yes, we are Colombo-centric, and maybe the problems don't really hit us right below the belt, but yes, it will hit us sometime. So it starts with us. Education may not happen in the formal sense, but education, we will have to make education work. And how do we do that? Again, ourselves. And one other thing, don't leave your future in the hands of individuals. That is where we have gone wrong. We expect those individuals to take our agendas and fight for it. They don't. So we have to do it ourselves. Thank you very much, ladies. Sarah, Amalini, and Yamini. Thank you so much for a very informative discussion. I do hope our vision of having, hopefully, a peaceful Sri Lanka will materialize someday.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Tharu signature ambience and cocktails and canapes. It's just fellowship time for everyone to have a chat with all our panelists as well and find out a little more if you would like to. And also, are your books here? So Sarah's book is here if anyone wants to get a copy. Believe you me, it's one of the best reads I have had in a long time. Gave me an insight into areas that, I would never have stepped into. So I remember my husband sitting at the launch, and he read the entire book while all the conversations were going on, and he said, this is a book that we must all read. So please, her book is available if you'd like to have it, and besides that, please do stay on for some conversation and good food and music.